Alright, so what was the impact of the Revolutionary War? Well, some of the obvious ones is the United States will become a country. It's going to be a relatively weak country at first, but nevertheless, it is a country, and it embodies the ideas of the Enlightenment, and they're basically a test, and everyone was going to be watching them to see how they do. They're going to see, essentially, if separation of church and state works, whether or not the social contract works, and this new form of government, the democracy, or Republican democracy, is going to pan out. So that's what everyone is watching. So with the end of the Revolutionary War, the British actually are going to recognize the 13 colonies, which was very surprising. Basically, they are also going to give more land to the Americans than many initially thought as well. They actually expand their border far past the Appalachian Mountains as well. The reason for this is they thought that France was more of a threat, and if there was an alliance between the Americans and the French might get a foothold in North America. So to prevent that, they gave them more land than they initially were thinking about. They viewed France as a greater threat, and that's going to be demonstrated by the peace treaty in France. Now, as far as moving in on the United States, what they're going to do is, and this will lead into some of the effects as well, is the Americans are going to reduce land requirements for voting. Basically, what was put forth in Declaration of Independence is that everyone has the right to pursue happiness, wealth, and so on and so forth, and to participate in government. And so what they do is at this period of time, not everyone was given the right to vote. Instead, how you got your right to vote was how much property you had, because the idea was if you had property in the United States, you would contribute and you would vote based on the fact that you had something to lose. And this essentially was how it worked in the world prior to this point. It certainly doesn't work like it does today. They're also going to include a separation of church and state in many of the 13 colonies as well. Now, the first constitution of sorts that's going to be put forth is in 1781 to 1787. What this Congress is going to have is only one house. It is not going to have an executive branch, and this is seen as a confederation, an alliance between these 13 colonies. This was a relatively weak constitution. Part of the reason being was there weren't any taxes. Congress could ask for money from the states, but it was completely up to the states whether or not they wanted to give it. Now, if you look to yourselves, if the United States government asked for $100, $1,000, most people aren't going to give it. And if that was completely voluntarily, most people aren't going to give up their money. Same sort of situation here. And so what that did was the Congress could not regulate the economy, they could not pay off debt, they really couldn't enforce any sort of trade agreements with foreign powers. They could not raise an army, that was completely voluntarily as well. And basically, the Congress was completely powerless. It had no power. And the United States had a debt of about $28 million. So it really didn't look very good for the United States. And the British basically looked at this and said it's going to fail. Well, we knew it, and maybe they would come back into the British Empire. Alright, so how do we get to the Articles of Confederation, to the United States Constitution? Basically, what's going to happen is the United States Constitution that we know as today is going to be called forth in 1787. A stronger government was clear. Basically, there was a rebellion in the United States by a bunch of veterans who needed money, and the United States government couldn't raise an army to put down the rebellion. It was a bunch of volunteers, which worked out, but the United States government just didn't have any power. And so in 1787, they called for a constitutional convention to reform the plan. There's two plans, the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. The Virginia Plan was to scrap the entire Articles of Confederation, start over. The New Jersey Plan was to reform it. What eventually came through was that the United States Constitution was going to be completely scrapped. What you're going to see is basically the government that we have in place today. You're going to have a bicameral Congress, where you're going to have a House of Representatives, as well as a Senate. You are going to have an executive branch. You're going to have the judicial branch. Part of the reason why they didn't want an executive branch in the Articles of Confederation was because they had just been under a king. They saw the king as being a bad idea, and so they completely scrapped it. So you didn't have a president of the United States in the Articles of Confederation. Now, with the United States Constitution, you are going to have a president of the United States, a leader, somebody in charge, and then, of course, Congress is going to vote on legislation, and so on and so forth. Slavery is not going to be abolished at this time, as many of you probably well know, and women are not going to get the right to vote either. So it is kind of ironic, but you are going to see an end to indentured servitude. So, having gone by that, I'm not going to go over, for example, every single part of the United States Constitution. You can look at that on your own time. But with this little experiment, people in Europe saw what worked and what didn't work. And with the United States Constitution being formed, this looked like a plan that was going to work. They worked out their kinks, and they saw many of the values of the Enlightenment movement. You saw the Bill of Rights, separation of church and state, social contract, the tabula rasa, on and on and on. There's many, many ideas being employed in these constitution. And so with that, one of the later effects, certainly you have the United States, it becomes a very strong country, and it still has, for example, the United States Constitution in place today. But the big part is going to be France, and what we move into the second part with the French Revolution. The French, during the Revolutionary War, had bankrolled the United States, gave them a bunch of weapons, a bunch of supplies, employed their navy. War is very expensive. So they basically wiped out their treasury funding this war for the United States, which we're very thankful for here in the United States. But regardless, it bankrupted the entire state of France. But then the French citizens start to look at America, and they see this experiment, the social experiment with politics and government, and they see, hey, maybe we can employ this in France. And so what you get in the next several years is, as the economic situation in France gets worse, people get a little more desperate, a little more experimental, and they start to try to apply these lessons from certainly the American Revolution in France. But I will talk about that with the French Revolution. So, impact. We got the United States, a constitution that many countries around the world are going to use. Many of the ideas of the Americans are also going to be used around the world as time goes on. But one of the big impacts, debatable whether or not it's a bigger impact, is the French Revolution, and a lot of chaos going on in France as well as Europe after this period of time. But we'll look at that next.